Hey, what's up everybody? It's me again. So I had a question because recently I've been talking a lot about some color sciencey things, but mostly I've been talking about saturation across a few videos and how to control it in different ways and then targeting chroma versus luma. And specifically on the luma, I was asked, hey, if color can be sort of targeted and modified in different ways, what can we do with, luminosity information and not color information? How are there different ways to modify that? And how do we better even understand that? Well, let's talk a little bit about that, see if we can make some sense, okay? So what I've done, because we're going to be talking about contrast, we need black to white. That's the main luma, right? So we have a gradient fill going across the way from black on the right to white on the left. And there it is. Now we can modify it. So let's go with curves as the first adjustment layer that we're going to turn on because people generally use curves, right? I mean, curves are very useful. And on top of that, we kind of understand what they do on a real image, but we may not understand what they do when we're just looking at what amounts to a technical chart, which is a gradient in this case. So as you can see on our curves little sort of properties, we see that the histo is obviously strange. It's like a little smiley face, right? And that's because this is not a normal histo. It's nothing you'd ever experience in a real photo. Graphics, sure, but not so much photos. Now, what is great about curves is that we can modify on a curve. You see how when we darken, it's not entirely clear what's going on, but you can tell that it looks generally darker and generally brighter on our curve. Now, before we go back to the curve, let's go to the levels real quick, because you may or may not have heard that levels is, and no need to use it because curves exist. And there's some truth to that. Let me show you what I'm talking about. So with levels on, if I were to take the right side here and brighten it in, you see what we're doing. We're increasing effectively, we're just compressing, if you will, the overall spread. Now, anything on this side here, and like in this white area, obviously has just been completely turned to white because of the nature of the graphic. But if we put it all the way down here to 128, which is right there in the middle, we have cut it down the middle. See that? Because we take the entire range of the contrast, which is sort of, I don't know, let's call this an even sweep of contrast, right? And if we cut it by bringing in the bright input point, then we have it right down the middle, right? Now on curves, if we pull these nodes around, we can have similar results. If we pull it in here, you see, I'm not taking the curve, I'm just taking the actual node, putting it all the way to 128, right? Just type it in, I guess. There you go. Oops, I typed in the wrong number again. There we go, right? Right down the middle, as you can see, exactly the same as curves. Now, isn't that interesting? Now, before we go to brightness and contrast, if I go to this 50% gray layer, right? No color information, just 50% gray. If I turn it on, obviously I fill it. But if I put it on divide, I cut it right down the middle. And that's because it starts as 50% and then divides the pixels underneath. So to review, curves can be used to sort of cut everything in half linearly. Levels can be used the exact same way. And it's all the equivalent of dividing against 50% gray, if that makes sense. But we're doing these things in a way that is more intuitive, that's more of an actual tool instead of just a simple calculation. And that, going back to what I was going to say about curves, that is why curves are so useful, because we could pull up and down on a curve and have these sort of results that make more sense to us, and they're more organic, because a photo is organic. You're not going to have a beautiful, perfect white to black contrast like this on a photo. So it makes more sense to have that kind of organic feel, that curved feel, and you get smoother looking, more natural changes. Levels, let's go ahead and reset that, because at the same time, levels has the exact same functions that curves has. It does not have a curve function, but it basically has the exact same ability, just on a linear manner, right? You don't have the curve element. Now, brightness and contrast is another one that I've been asked questions about for two reasons. If you're an old Photoshop guy, then you know that there's this legacy button here that makes the old makes the new brightness and contrast work like the old one. Now, this has been a long time since it's been the new one. We haven't seen the legacy contrast in many, many years, but it's there in case you need it for graphic design purposes. Let me explain why. On normal, which is without use legacy checked, if you boost the contrast all the way, look what happens. You see that? You see how it just kind of tightens in the mid-range. We're not pulling in the left side or the brightness in, and we're not pulling the right side, the darkness, in either. We're simply kind of crunching and compressing the main middle areas to create contrast in a middle tone sort of focus, right? Okay, now brightness obviously works pretty predictably. However, it's a little smoother than levels or curves. So if you put it all the way, you still get this cool gradient. It's a different sort of algorithm that I don't know what it is. But when you take the contrast down, you can see what it does. It pulls that middle section out towards the edges. And when you take it in, it pulls the middle section in. It's throttled to some amount that Adobe said this is right. Now, on legacy mode, if you crank the contrast all the way, you get, that's it. See what it's doing? It just keeps dividing and dividing and dividing. And eventually, because it's focused on the mids, this is what you get, cut right down the middle. And because it's a calculation, because of the way contrast slider works, you get a direct, sharp line. So you can sort of replicate that with levels if you come in here and type in 127 and 129. However, because there's a little bit of a gap there, a little bit of a blend in the calculations, you have a little blurred spot in between. It can't go all the way to a hard edge the way brightness and contrast seems to do. Most likely because it's related to the focus on the mid-range as opposed to levels, which has a mid-range shift. As you can see here, you can shift the mid-range. Okay, but you can't just arbitrarily add contrast just to the mid-range. So that's why, to me, brightness and contrast has its use, but it depends on how I want to add contrast. If I want a mid-tone focus contrast where I like the lows and the highs where they are, but I kind of want to add a little more sort of attention, if you will, to the mids, I might try brightness and contrast first. I might. But if I want overall contrast, you know, especially in a mastering method, then I might use levels. And if I want to brighten and darken, I tend to use curves because of how natural that is. So again, I'm not saying you need to memorize this sort of thing to know how to work with these tools on your images, but when you have the idea of why they work the way they work, even if they're similar, you can understand, oh, okay, I want to add contrast to the midsection or to the middle tones, as it were. Maybe brightness and contrast is my first choice, right? Levels and curves, obviously very, very similar. But for me to repeat, curves is my brightening and darkening, usually, though occasionally I add contrast with it as well, and I'll explain why in a minute. And levels, of course, is a great way to add really pronounced contrast because you don't have the lovely power of curves. So it's great for finishing, in my opinion, especially when you use the output levels. Because if you take the output levels up, you see what we're doing now is we're limiting how dark anything underneath can get. With an output level of 20, it can't get any darker than that. Anything that happens above it can darken it further, but anything that happens below it, like below the levels there, it will not show any darker than that 20. So effectively, if I put 100 and 155 here, I have reduced the contrast radically, and you can see that, right? Anything that happens underneath it will be fixed to that range, and that's what I call compression. I'll put one of those sometimes in the very top of an entire layer stack, and that's my compressor to kind of bring everything together, right? Curves, we talked about contrast. One of the reasons why people do the S curve for contrast. Okay, let's turn that off and on. This sort of focuses on the mid-range, right? It kind of brings it in tighter in a different sort of way than brightness and contrast does, and you can control it more obviously, right? You can darken the low area more, and you can brighten the bright area more or less. You can control exactly how you want. All we're doing is compressing or widening this band, if you will, and deciding where the focus is on the low end or the high end, right? See how we're doing that? It doesn't even look all that contrasty, really. It will on an image very radically, but that is why it works. Now, because this node up here and this node down here on the curves are not touched, that's why it doesn't change. It doesn't over darken and over brighten. As a rule, you can definitely ruin it on your own. So again, it's not that one is better than the other in the realm of contrast, whether it's reduction or increasing. It's not that one is better or worse. It's just a matter of, well, what are you doing? You know, what is your goal and what does the image need? So maybe, for example, a very dark, deep image that I want to add contrast to, I might be real careful about it and use maybe only curves, right? So I can exactly decide where my contrast boosts are going to be. Overall, even toned image, and I want to add some contrast, I might try brightness and contrast. I want to add a lot of depth to a very light image, I might use levels because I can bring that dark point up any way I want, right? These are just subconscious things. It's not like we need to calculate it. There isn't the wrong way to do it. If it looks good to your eye, it's the right way. You succeeded. But these are just some thoughts on how to control contrast. And don't forget, guys, if you're curious or if you were curious, the difference between normal modern day contrast boosting and legacy, Well, one is direct and linear, complete direct calculation, and it'll end up doing this to your image, and I'm sure you've seen it if you've experimented. And Adobe determined that that was not very useful, despite the fact that it's a very linear direct calculation, not very useful for most people, so they throttled it in some manner. So I hope that answers some questions, or at least give you some food for thought. If you have any questions, please leave a comment below.